Hey guys, so this is going to be the video for the first section of chapter 10. Now, to start us off, I want to remind you guys that in chapter 6, we talked about the 5 basic strategies for research. We talked about the experimental, or we didn't talk about, we introduced, I guess I should say, the experimental strategy, the non-experimental strategy, the quasi-experimental strategy, and then correlational and descriptive. Those are the 5 that we introduced, right? In the last 2 and 3 chapters, we've talked about the experimental strategy. We introduced it in chapter 7, but we've talked about it a lot the last few chapters. In chapter 12, we're going to discuss the correlational strategy, and in chapter 13, we're going to discuss the descriptive strategy. But this chapter, chapter 10, as you can see from the title, we're going to talk about the non-experimental and the quasi-experimental strategies. So these are the chapter objectives. For this chapter, there are 12. So there's 6 on this slide, and there is 6 on this slide. And remember, these are the ones you want to read before you do the chapter, kind of give your brain some prep work to know where you're going, where you're headed, what to look for. And then at the end of the chapter, you should be able to make sense of all this. You should be able to understand all of this. And if not, then you may need to go back and look at reread some things or reach out to me for help. So for section 1, first I want to start out, before we start talking about this, I want to reference the study that your textbook mentions. It's the study on adversity and well-being. The idea looking at if adversity makes you stronger, like the whole saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. They were trying to, scientifically research that. And so they compared 3 groups: a non-adversity group, or no adversity group, a some adversity, they had experienced some adversity in their lives, and then the third group was high adversity, they had experienced a lot of adversity in their lives. And then they compared their well-being scores, however they measured that, to see if their well-being was different between each of the groups. Now, on the surface, that kind of sounds like an experiment, right? It sounds like what we've been talking about. There was 3 groups, they compared scores between them. But if you dig a little deeper and you think through it a little bit more critically, you realize that there was no manipulation here, right? The adversity groups existed prior to the experiment beginning. They came into the experiment already in one of those categories, right? They either had experienced adversity or they had not. The researchers didn't put them in adversity situations. They didn't hurt them or their loved ones, obviously. They didn't do anything traumatic like that. So they either had already experienced adversity or they had not. And so there was no manipulation there. The researchers had no control over which group they were going to be placed into or they were going to be in, right? Because again, they had either experienced adversity or not. That is a fundamental part of who the participant is. And later we'll talk about how that's called a participant variable. And so the researchers had no control over that, which means they didn't have any control over any extraneous variables that would have influenced whether they ended up in the adversity group or not. And then therefore the well-being scores, which it was the sort of the dependent variable they were looking at. So that is what makes that a non-experimental strategy, because it does not meet the requirements of an actual experiment. So in this section, we're going to go over learning objective number 1, which is defining, comparing, contrasting the experimental, the non-experimental, and the quasi-experimental strategies so that you can kind of understand why they are different. And so let me go to this next slide. But before we discuss this, I want to touch on something that your textbook points out in one of the chapters in the introduction part of the section. It says that in many research situations, it's difficult or impossible for a researcher to completely satisfy those rigorous requirements for an experiment, like we just talked about. It's definitely more true for applied research, especially in natural settings like education, in the classroom, or clinical research with real clients. Because again, there's situations there where either ethically they cannot manipulate variables, or just logistically, because it's in that natural setting, they can't manipulate the variables. And so in those situations, especially education and clinical settings, the researchers often are going to use a research strategy where they collect the data similar to an experiment, and then they're going to compare those scores, compare the groups of scores just like an experiment. But again, it's going to fail to satisfy at least one of the requirements of a true experiment, either because of the manipulation or the control or something like that. So even though they look like experiments, they usually are going to contain some sort of confounding variable or some other threat to internal validity that is an integral part of the design, so it cannot be removed. Remember, when we talked about experiments, we talked about if there were threats to internal validity or some kind of confounding variable, we want to try to remove it, right, or adjust for it. In these situations, it is such a fundamental part of the design that you can't remove that variable, or you can't change the way that that's done. And so because of that, it's going to be considered non-experimental or quasi-experimental instead. And because of that, you can't establish that unambiguous cause and effect relationship, which we kind of talked about that a second ago. But it's not a true experiment. And so we would say, in that example of adversity and well-being, we would say that adversity is potentially influencing well-being, or we would say adversity is higher adversity or lower adversity is related to this part of well-being, or whatever. It still gives you lots of valuable information about how variables are related. We just can't make those cause and effect definitive statements from non-experimental or quasi-experimental studies. But again, we can still get lots of valuable information. So here on the slide, it talks about how the structure of the two, again, is very similar to an experiment, but as far as distinguishing between non-experimental and quasi-experimental, it really boils down to whether or not they are making efforts to limit the confounding variables or those threats to internal validity. So remember, like we just talked about, with these two designs, there's going to be some element of a confounding variable or a threat to internal validity that cannot be changed. And that's what makes it non-experimental or quasi-experimental. A non-experimental design is going to be the most naturalistic. It makes little or no attempt to minimize those threats to internal validity. It just accepts, the way the variables are, that they're going to have to be that way for that experimental design, and they just acknowledge that it is considered non-experimental. A quasi-experimental design is going to make some attempt to minimize those threats to internal validity. So again, it's going to be almost, but it's still not quite a true experiment, because they won't be able to account for everything. There will still be some sort of confounding variable or threat that they cannot limit or minimize. And so because of that, it will be considered quasi-experimental instead. Let me make sure. Okay, yes. I did not mean to do that. Oh, why is my scroll thing not working? There we go. Wrong scroll bar. Okay. So the structure of non-experimental and quasi-experimental designs, again, looks very similar to an experiment. As we mentioned in that second point, says studies produce groups of scores that can be compared for significant differences. So again, sounds just like an experiment. If we look here at our textbook figure 10.1, it shows you the structure of an experiment. They're comparing aggressive behavior scores. They're comparing them between a TV violence group and a non-TV violence group, right, to see if there's any difference. That is an actual true experiment. They manipulated whether they were exposed to TV violence or they were not. This is a true experiment. If we scroll down to figure 10.2 and see two examples of non-experimental or quasi-experimental, you see that the structure visually looks the same, right? It looks exactly the same as the other picture we just looked at. The difference is that, if we go back to my slide here, that third point, the difference is that the scores that you see in those examples are not produced by manipulating an independent variable, but instead are produced or determined by the groups are defined in terms of a participant variable. So instead of an independent variable, they are considered a participant variable. And then also the slide doesn't say this, but there's also time-related variables. So participant variables are things like gender, or whether or not they went to college, which is the example they use here in this part A of figure 10.2, whether they went to college or not. In the example we used at the beginning of this video, it was how much adversity they had experienced in their lives. That would have been a participant variable. And so you can see in part A, they're comparing verbal test scores between whether the college graduates and the non-college graduates, or people that had not gone to college. And so again, it looks similar to an experiment, but the difference there is that those categories, the college and the no college, was not manipulated. They didn't keep people from going to college, right? Or force people to go to college. That wasn't manipulated. They didn't control what group they went into. They showed up already being in a group, right? They showed up saying, I either went to college or I didn't. And so that is again, fundamental part of who they are as a participant. And so it is considered a participant variable. And so it is not truly experimental because it's not manipulated or controlled for. This second example down here in part B, that is a time-related variable that I was talking about. And that is usually when there's some sort of therapy or clinical intervention of some kind. And in those cases, there's a before treatment or before therapy and after therapy, and they're comparing depression scores between the two to see if the therapy was effective or if the therapy helped, right? Now, some of you might be looking at that and thinking that looks very similar to some of the experiments, the examples that we talked about in the experiment chapters, and it does. But the difference here, if you really think it through, is that the before and after therapy categories, again, they're not manipulated or controlled. These are people that went through therapy for depression, and you're comparing their scores before they were in therapy and after they were in therapy. You didn't control that. You didn't manipulate whether or not they experienced the therapy or not. And again, this is one of those examples where you have to consider ethics. Some people say it's okay, and some people would disagree. But you didn't manipulate whether they were able to receive treatment or not. Whether you didn't say this group of people is going to receive therapy for depression and this group is not. Obviously, that's not fair to the group that is suffering from depression and they're not receiving therapy. So a lot of times in situations like this, they will use a non-experimental or quasi-experimental strategy here so that everybody can experience the therapy and receive hopefully the benefits of the therapy and improve their mental health. But you can still get the valuable information that you need, and you can still compare the groups of scores. You're just going to compare everybody's scores before the therapy and after the therapy. But because you're not truly manipulating, there's not groups it's based on time. It's before and after therapy. It's not based on your manipulation or anything like that. Because of that, and because of the lack of control there over who ends up in the therapy and everything, that is considered non-experimental or quasi-experimental. And so this table 10.1 is going a little bit further, introducing you. So this is talking about the two different examples of non-experimental and quasi-experimental, those participant variables and those time-related variables. This is showing you how there are two different designs or two different categories of designs, just like with the experimental strategy we talked about between subjects and within subjects design. There's a similar design structure here, but for non-experimental and quasi-experimental, again, because there's not a true independent variable being manipulated, the between subjects designs are called non-equivalent group designs, and the within subjects designs are called pre-post designs. And you'll see this table also tells you the purpose of each and some examples of each, but a lot of this isn't really going to make a whole lot of sense to you until we dig deeper into what these are. And in fact, the next video, we're going to talk about the between subjects, non-equivalent group designs. So all of that will make more sense. Let's do the learning check real quick to wrap up this video, and then you guys will get to move on and learn more about what all this means. So for the first one, it says a non-experimental design, and then you have to finish that sentence. And so looking at these answers, if we start at the bottom, manipulates one variable similar to an experiment. Well, again, if there's manipulation, it's not experimental, so that can't be the answer. Or I'm sorry, I said that backwards, I think. If they're manipulating, it isn't experimental, so it cannot be non-experimental. I think I said that backwards. And then the third answer, controls extraneous variables similar to an experiment. Again, if they are controlling extraneous variables, then it is experimental. It could possibly be quasi-experimental depending on what they're doing, but it is definitely not non-experimental because there is no attempt there. And so you can see that first answer actually makes no attempt to minimize threats to validity, to that internal validity. It's, again, the most naturalistic, however it occurs, naturally, design. And the second answer makes some attempts to minimize threats to validity. Hopefully you recognized that is the quasi-experimental design, is when they actually do make some attempts to minimize those threats. And then the last question here, which of the following is an example of a non-experimental study? So I'm going to scroll all the way up so you can see all the answers, hopefully. Again, non-experimental, so we're looking at an example. If we start at the bottom, a study comparing cognitive function scores for one group of Alzheimer's patients who are assigned to receive memory therapy. I can stop right there. I don't even need to go all the way through that, because that word assigned should be a red flag for you, because if they are being assigned to a group, there's that control there's that manipulation. That means it's an experiment, right? It cannot be non-experimental if there is an assignment process going on. And so if you look, the second answer has the same thing. It says a study comparing depression scores for one group that is assigned to receive therapy versus another group that is assigned not to receive therapy. Again, they're assigning people to groups. They're manipulating who is in what group. That is an actual experiment. So if we look at the third answer here, a study comparing performance in a room where the walls have been painted yellow versus performance in a room painted blue. Hopefully you recognize that as an example from the experiments we've talked about. Again, because there's manipulation, right? They are painting the rooms, they're placing them in either a yellow room or a blue room, and so there's manipulation there, and so it is an actual experiment. If you look at this top answer, a study comparing self-esteem scores for children with a learning disability versus scores for children without a learning disability, hopefully you've recognized, or just through process of elimination, that is an example of a non-experimental study. Again, why? Because they are coming into the study. This is a participant variable. They are coming into the study with a learning disability or without. There's no manipulation here. The researchers are not giving them a learning disability or removing a learning disability, right? They either have one or they don't. And so they're comparing the groups of scores of self-esteem between the two groups, between the two participant variable groups. It's not a true independent variable, right? It's not being manipulated. It is a participant variable. So hopefully that helps kind of clarify things for you guys and help you understand the difference between all of these. And that is it for section 10.1.